Hi everyone, part 2 of Module 1 for OHC. In this part we look at workplace hazards and risks, and some of the following will be a familiar material for many of you, but it's important to revise them as it's fundamental concepts that we need to be very familiar with in OHS hazardous substance management. It's based on three concepts. The first one is identification or recognition, which involves the identification of hazards and their adverse health effects. The second one's assessment or evaluation, which involves the compilation of knowledge and results of quantitative measurements or estimates of exposure in order to evaluate the risk of impairment of health and well-being by work and work operations. And control, which involves the formulation of recommendations to eliminate or minimise exposure to hazards in the workplace through the application of a hierarchy of control measures, being elimination, substitution, isolation, engineering controls, administrative controls, and the use of personal protective equipment, which are the principles which relate to risk management that we'll identify again and again throughout this and other courses. This table uses the conventional classification of types of workplace hazards to give some examples of the potential harm from each of these. The workplace hazard classifications traditionally used, which we should be thinking of all the time when we're working in this area, are chemical, biological, mechanical, psychological and physical hazards. And the potential harm, whole variety of harm when we're looking at managing exposures, it's the route of exposure and also the actual effect. So I want you to read through. Think about that list, please. When we're talking about perception and quantification of risk, one of the things that we need to be very aware of is that people view risk differently. If we consider the example of a large chemical plant near a residential area, the plant might have been there for a long time, having been built before the residential area became established. People moved in, and the nearby residents view the plant as dangerous, with the potential to cause great harm, so they see it as high risk. The staff at the plant have a different perception of the risk. They understand the hazards and the effects of the hazards, and they know that there's controls in place to reduce these effects in the event of an incident, so they see it as low risk. The public, however, remembers incidents involving large chemical plants where people were exposed to hazards and there was actual harm, not just the potential to cause harm. These different perceptions of the risk may not be easily reconciled, and the view of the staff at the plant may be correct, but they could have become complacent, and therefore they may not be correct. The view of the nearby residents may be incorrect, but should they be convinced otherwise? There are many factors that are involved in assessing the acceptability of risk, and many issues related to this, which we'll discuss throughout the subject. One important factor is the voluntary or involuntary nature of the exposure to risk. You do often see this sort of situation. I'm just thinking of airports where people, an airport's built, people move into the area, or they know that the land has been zoned for that airport to be built or an extra runway to be added for many, many years, and then when it happens, they complain about the exposures to noise. And there's lots of argument about these things of, should people consider the risk? And at the moment in Melbourne, we're having these sort of arguments about exposure to potential hazards, environmental hazards, fumes, etc., related to the building of a tunnel and new freeway in the eastern part of Melbourne, where that potential has been there for many, many years. This table describes the risks of death for people in the USA in 2003. The lifetime risks in the table is calculated by dividing the USA population in 2003, which was 290,850,005, by the number of deaths, divided by 77.6, which was the life expectancy of a US citizen born in 2003. I haven't been able to find anything more recent quite like this. This is actually put out by the wonderfully named International Shark Attack file, which is from the Florida Museum of Natural History, which is an organisation devoted to maintaining sharks and the reputation of sharks. And this was done to illustrate the very low likelihood of death due to a shark attack in the lifetime. And what you can see down the bottom is that it's 1 in less than, or nearly 4 million. Whereas heart disease, cancer, stroke, hospital infections, flu, car accidents, right up there. And the point they're making is that people's perception of death in terms of those very relatively common factors is much lower than their perception of the risk of death from a shark attack. So quite a nice little summary of the difference between perceptions and reality in this terming calculations of risk of actual death. So despite the risk of death due to some of those activities, some people have clearly decided that risk is acceptable. Few people have decided not to participate in using cars or being on water. Some people have decided not to participate in smoking or eating fat-saturated foods, while others have decided to participate, therefore increasing their likelihood of cardiac disease or stroke. So the amount of risk, or the likelihood of death in this particular case, is not necessarily the factor which makes people decide which risks are acceptable. It seems that other factors are more important, therefore, than the amount of risk. Other factors may have some effect on risk perception, and Cavallo in 1997, in an important discussion, argued that often people's perception, cultures, backgrounds are what made the difference. He argued that people like unions would regard the health and safety of workers the paramount consideration in any considerations, rather than things like costs and environmental or other factors that maybe insurers think of. People from different cultures and backgrounds will perceive risk differently, and often it's to do with their own experience in the past and exposure to conditions that many of us would never even imagine, that are much more hazardous than anything we experience in our lifetime. In Australia, there's been a history of acceptance of dangerous working conditions in our past, and this may be largely due to a largely male itinerant workforce in earlier times, with young men working on construction projects, cattle stations, farms and mines, and in remote areas which may have fostered a culture of risk-taking or an acceptance of danger. Most countries accept risks associated with driving vehicles, regardless of the fact that annually about 1.2 million people worldwide are killed in motor vehicle crashes. And yet, despite this, many countries have very poor road safety strategies. At an individual level, most of us accept that independent vehicle transportation, or the use of vehicles, involves a trade-off with accepting the risk of motor vehicle crashes. Generally, women appear to be less inclined to accept risk than men, although there may also be a tendency for men to be involved in more risky behaviours and or occupations. A person's age can also be a factor in relation to risk acceptance. An older worker who has become experienced and skilled in an occupation is less inclined than an inexperienced person to accept risk. A younger person may step where angels are feared to tread, so to speak. Alternatively, knowledge about a risk, particularly from one's own experience, may incline a person to go to extremes to either discount or inflate that risk. When we're talking about risk assessment, the general risk assessment, which was introduced earlier, it's important to revise these terms because they're often confuse the terms risk and hazard, because they're often used interchangeably when we're discussing hazardous substances. Tillman, when we're talking about hazardous substances, describes these as hazard being the potential for a substance to cause adverse effects. A hazardous substance is one which has sufficient toxicity to cause harm, given the appropriate conditions of exposure or absorption. Risk is a function of the likelihood of an adverse effect occurring in a particular situation and of the magnitude of the adverse effects or consequences or severity of the outcome. If a hazardous substance is to cause harm, the worker must be exposed to a sufficiently large amount of the substances. And you should note that these are slightly different definitions from those that are generally used in broader terms in terms of OHS risk management practice. Brewer talks about risk control and defines hazard as a condition or changing set of circumstances that presents a potential for illness, injury, or property damage. So this is now introducing another concept, and often we also see environmental damage brought into risk assessment parameters. It's a potential or inherent characteristics of an activity, condition, or circumstance which can produce adverse or harmful consequences. Hazardous control is any means of eliminating or reducing the risk resulting from a hazard. Hazard recognition is perceiving or being aware that a hazard does or can exist. The terms consequence and probability are also important in risk assessment. Both the consequence or severity and the likelihood of probability are usually taken into account. This is illustrated by these definitions here, where the consequence is measured, the descriptor of insignificant, for example, the descriptors are described in terms of the consequences, and we have harm or no injury or catastrophic being death, and then we have financial loss, and we also have the release of toxicity, whether it's on or off site in the descriptors, and therefore how detrimental that is to not only financial costs, but also reputational risk and also environmental risk. So all of these factors can come into the terms in terms of consequence and probability. There's a number of matrices around for these, and these are widely used, and these terms need to be used with some caution because they're industry to industry. A lot of different organisations have developed these, or they're used across companies or different industries, but very few, if any, of them are evidence-based, and we need to be really cautious how we use them. Organisations need to make decisions on what level of risk is acceptable, but very often an attention is given to the most important hazards, or the ones with the major consequences or likelihoods, and that's where these risk matrices come in. But the remaining 80% are often the ones where it's really important that we focus as well, because very often there's really inexpensive controls which can be put in place, or they're relatively easy to eliminate. The hazards are relatively easy to eliminate, and if we manage those, we don't end up with these major or catastrophic incidences occurring. So yes, we need to focus on the big ones, but we really need to focus on the minor or moderate ones as well. Okay, that's that revision done. And what I want you to do now is stop and access and watch this Peter Sandman video on risk perception. Peter Sandman's been a bit of a guru in this area of risk perception for many years, and some of you may be familiar with his work. And in this video, towards the end of it, it does actually refer you to his website, and I would suggest that you go and explore that a little too, and there's lots of other interesting videos you can watch there. His premise is that risk equals hazard plus exposure is also can be overrun by another premise, which is risk equals hazard plus outrage, and the amount of outrage there is around an exposure really defines how people perceive what's going on. But go and watch that and you can form your own conclusions. And then I want you to download and read Pam Pryor's chapter of hazard as a concept, which is chapter 15 from the OHS body of knowledge, and the reference to that is there. Then I want you to think about the different definitional approaches that Pam describes in terms of what hazard means, and think about that in terms of what we've covered in this module already and what Peter Sandman says. Then select 3 hazard definitions from your workplace and discuss those which apply to chemicals or other physical substances in workplace scenarios with which you're familiar. Think about how these different definitions fit, and then I want you to be prepared to discuss this on our Collaborate session.